9.6 Homeostasis. Homeostasis is one of the characteristics of life that we discussed in Lesson 1. What this means is that living organisms try to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. Now, certainly not static or unchanging, but things need to be kept within a narrow physiological range. And so changes can take place in the environment, and the organism attempts to respond to these changes to keep various things in this physiological range. This could be body temperature, blood pH, oxygen concentration, many things that must be kept within some narrow ranges. Failure in these homeostatic adjustments results in various illness or disease. Homeostasis is normally maintained through feedback loops. Feedback loops are going to monitor some condition. They consist of a sensor that's going to send information to a control center. The control center can make decisions then and activate an effector. The effector is going to be a nerve, a muscle, a gland, a hormone, something that can actually respond to the change. So that is depicted here in this diagram. Some condition is being monitored down at the bottom. If we have some change in this, that is detected by the sensor, sends information to the control center. Eventually the effector can oppose that, so return to the normal physiological range. Most of the feedback loops in the body are negative feedback loops. A negative feedback loop is one that is going to oppose the stimulus. So if something gets too high, we're going to try to push it back down. If something gets too low, we're going to try to bring it back up. So negative feedback opposes the change. Here's a little more complex diagram that illustrates negative feedback. Let's assume that the thing that is being monitored here is temperature of your office or temperature of your home, so we want it to stay within a specific range. If it gets too high, there is a sensor that detects that. It would be a thermometer. That thermometer or thermostat then sends the information to the control center, which would be a switch. That switch is going to be activated to turn the furnace off, and so the room is going to cool back down. We can go the opposite way down towards the bottom of the diagram. If the room gets too cold, again, the sensor, the thermostat, will detect that, send the information to the control center, again, activate the switch, which would represent the effector. The furnace comes on, and we're going to warm the room back up. A physiological example would be blood pressure. If blood pressure gets too low, there are receptors in some arteries that detect that. They send that information to the regulatory center in the brain. The brain then can activate some muscles and nerve impulse to constrict muscles in the artery walls, and that would bring blood pressure back up. So again, we could go through many examples of these negative feedback loops that are involved in homeostasis. Another example, regulation of body temperature. Let's see what might happen if we get too hot. If we get too hot, we're going to sweat, and so as that sweat evaporates off the skin, that pulls away heat. Also, blood vessels in the skin are going to dilate, and that increases blood flow to the surface of the body so that more heat can radiate away, can evaporate that perspiration. If we're too cold, the erector pili muscle is going to contract, so we get the goosebumps as we attempt to fluff up our fur. In this case, blood vessels are going to constrict, and so we're going to try to limit blood flow out to the surface of the body, reroute that blood back to the core, and that will conserve heat. And also shivering, that involuntary contraction of muscle is an effort to produce heat. So in both cases, this would be negative feedback. If we are too hot, we're going to do things to try and lower our body temperature. If we get too cold, we do things to try and increase body temperature. There are very few positive feedback loops. Positive feedback is going to amplify the original stimulus or push the change in the same direction. If something gets too high, we're going to push it higher. If something gets too low, we would push it lower. So very few examples of positive feedback. A couple of examples: blood clotting. The reaction that initiates blood clotting is a positive feedback mechanism, and so once that is initiated, it is accelerated very quickly, which makes sense. We need to stop blood flow as quickly as blood loss as quickly as possible. Another example of positive feedback is uterine contractions during childbirth. Here is a diagram that illustrates how the positive feedback works with childbirth. Very late in gestation, the baby's head is going to engage the cervix, which is the opening between the vagina and the uterus. And as the baby's head pushes on the cervix, it causes some stretch. So this is the original stimulus. And the response to cervical stretch is the release of a hormone called oxytocin by the pituitary gland. And the target of oxytocin is the smooth muscle in the uterine wall. And it causes uterine contractions to increase. Well, if uterine contractions increase, what is that going to do to cervical stretch? It is going to increase cervical stretch, which was the initial stimulus. And that causes additional oxytocin to be produced, which causes uterine contractions to become stronger still. And so this would be an example of a positive feedback. We are causing this to get stronger and stronger, moving in the same direction. As soon as the baby is born, that is going to relieve cervical stretch, and it then breaks this positive feedback loop.